and the hardcore racist Nazi anti-Semitism. Now yes, about the prosecution, I said already, the Austrian courts are quite successful in fighting this kind of right-wing hardcore Nazism, anti-Semitism, and they are, this is a tragic story of, there was at that time, if we risk that people like Müller and Novak get acquitted, it's much better not to put them to justice at all. It's more negative if they get free after a trial, so let's forget about it. Now, I would say I don't have any proof of Minister of Justice like Christian Broda, and then you have a Minister of Justice like Böhmdorfer. And then you have the expectation, well, how long can those people like this Croatian, yes, how long can they live? The Standard and magazines like Profil write about it, critical, but nothing is happening. And maybe the Greens are making this a topic in a debate in Parliament, or maybe the Social Democrats even, but the Social Democrats are in a glass house because they are responsible for things of the past. The Greens are free because they don't have...
Maybe Irving on trial.
Yeah, but exactly, but this is...
Current.
Holocaust deniers are feeling the strength of the Austrian system. Holocaust perpetrators don't. Now this is an interesting, and it's almost impossible to explain it. And one
synthesize the situation by going back to a book publicized in 1926 or 25 by a Jewish Austrian journalist, I forgot his name, Die Stadt ohne Juden, the town without Jews. And I think there is a prophetic...
Were the laws, and after 2.5 years we raised it to the ambassadorial level again. I think that what we heard from Professor Pelinka, and also I agree with Mr. Zurov, a lot has been done in Austria, officially I mean, by the government in the educational field, also in the legislative field, but the persecution of the university, and it was very interesting. It's in all books in schools, they teach anti-Semitism, and there was a project called Letter to the Stars, which happened in Austria by the government when the President Kleistil, the late President Kleistil, which was a real friend to Israel, headed this project.
They are outstanding and completely accurate so far as I can tell, especially the generous compliments about me. And I'm learning an awful lot about your favourite Prime Minister, which I never knew. Even at this stage of reading.
And in, I don't remember exactly the date, but in a special date, these 50,000 letters were attached to white balloons and flown to the sky. I just took one letter, which didn't fly, the balloon, and it was from a child, 10 years old, Austrian, to a child which was to Israel. There are a lot of other comments, but we don't have time for that. I will be glad to speak personally after that to anybody. I understand that a lot of you don't agree with me. Thank you.
Final question, Chaim.
Yeah. Persian, Iranian community, Jewish community there, and I suppose that also some Jews from Russia, many Jews from Russia came there. Is it the policy of the community to invite other Jews to join and to make once again the Jewish community live again in Austria?
First of all, the Jews were just sent into exile, there was no extermination. And then the non-Jews realized that they need the Jews for certain businesses, for certain cultural activities and so on. And then they asked the Jews to come. These old departments, these old positions, and this was not the case. So the Austrians did not behave in the same way as it was portrayed in this extremely interesting novel. In that respect, it's a little bit naive with respect to what has happened after 1945 especially. Declares Hitler's employment policy has been proper.
Welcome you here for a speaker who already has been here very successfully last time on anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism, where we are going to publish a very good on Germany, who follows the German scene on a day-to-day basis, to speak about the falling of this taboo in Germany. A few announcements before the we have a lot of program. Next lecture on the 9th of the chairman of Professor Edberg, Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, in the United States, on all these issues of campuses, what the problem for professors on campuses, the post-colonial discourse on campuses. And then on the 1st of February, we have the Dan Ellers written on several books on Germany. He has also another interest, which is the role of sport in society. He has written a book called Offside, Soccer and American Exceptionalism, which I can really recommend because it gives slightly different insight.
Where I talked about the book that Manfred just kindly mentioned, and which will come out in Princeton with Princeton University Press under the, I think, very poignant title called The Uncouth Nation, because the whole argument is, it's very historical also, that the European view of MA students who get a master's in European studies, and I'm teaching a course about all things Austria, intensive everyday lecture of Austria, and I find it very interesting, as I told Manfred already. I'm also delighted that Richard Landis is here. I always liked his work very much, and virtually all its forms simply not acceptable. In other words, it was not, you could not utter it, you could not speak it, you could not have it in even vaguely accepted society. This two major dimensions, or two major reasons. One of them, of course, is the passage of time. And then the other one is that I think as a testimony to progress in advanced industrial democracies, and I'm a great advocate of this, we have come to a dimension where indeed, the paper is about Germany, but it really is really about Europe. The examples will be about Germany, but it really is, I think, a much greater issue. It's a much more pan-European, and I think, as Manfred suggested in this lecture that you'll be hearing, and I know that from his work and through the Institute or the Center, the massive proliferation, for instance, of klezmer bands, which are featuring non-Jewish Germans as producers and consumers to a degree that absolutely does not exist anywhere else in the world, including the United States and Israel. I don't think there's anywhere near as many klezmer bands or klezmer audiences in Israel as they are in Germany, and things like that, okay, which have also increased. Two developments, I think, are complementary but have very different origins pertaining to the Jews in Germany. The first, of course, mainly involves time. World War II is gradually receding as a factor affecting German life, thus making the Nazi era and its central events, of course the Holocaust, less relevant time of protection, but of course it comes from the language of hunting. It's the time that is allowed to protect the game. That was granted the Jews. This Schonzeit is actually a thing of the past. In German, indeed, European daily life, if not yet in politics, study shows, need not be anti-Semitic. In fact, I would say it is not anti-Semitic. What is anti-Semitic is, in fact, if it coincides with tropes that are clearly classically anti-Semitic. And just to add to Manfred's, this is sort of seminar style, Manfred's point about the study, what the study shows is that you can, in fact, conceptually, you are shifty, and what you have is that, in fact, it's a very high correlation between the two. Okay, that 90% of the cases, at least one or two of both items are expressed of the 9 that are shown. I'll conclude with an interesting research which goes even further than this. The conservative side tended to stand for relativization, exculpation, and rejection of permanent historical responsibility. But even at the time, however, such clear-cut classifications were misleading. Until the late 1970s, the relativizing and exculpating discourse, anti-Semitic gaffes, public rejections of responsibility, reliability, and other forms of mitigating German guilt, without this receiving special notice or criticism. Since the end of the war, those advocating a radical confrontation with the past were clearly in the minority. For example, even Chancellor Konrad Adenauer was only able to provide West Germany's first financial assistance to Israel were heard primarily in the Federal Republic itself. Taboo breaking has been on the rise since, so this created this powerful cultural image. Now I'd like to look at the taboo breaking that ensued in the 1980s. And the above statement by Cole is just one of many transgressions. He basically looks at, chronicles this taboo breaking, and he basically talks about the importance of what he calls secondary anti-Semitism. Broder encapsulates the taboo violation with an ironic sentence that he used as a chapter heading and borrowed from the Israeli psychoanalyst Tzvi Rex. This is primacy of Auschwitz in this discourse, which already, for instance, you see in France very strongly, again starting by the left. May 8th, of course, is the end of World War II. But there's also something else going on on May 8th. The French army commits France, or the end of World War II, but also France's atrocities, or the First World's atrocities against the Third World people. And so you kind of see this putting the context of challenging, in this case, again, crudely put, Auschwitz. And in this case, the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. Secondary anti-Semitism, activist, funky foreign minister, Europe's I think, most interesting politician, and Joschka Fischer. Had the CDU been in power, Joschka Fischer would have been at the head of the demonstration against the war. Okay? In the Frankfurt Paulskirche, a very eminent place, because after all, this was this gig. Okay? And Walser's speech sparked what I would have called the first anti-Semitism debate or dispute in the United Germany. What I'm referring here, of course, was to the original famous anti-Semitism dispute, which was triggered in 1879 and emasculates the German people. The Walser debate has not been resolved to this day, and indeed he continues. He published a equally powerful book called Tod eines Kritikers, Death of a Critic, in which he reiterates all these positions from 1998. The novel features that Walser's work in general bears major elements of anti-Semitism dating back to his seemingly left radical beginnings in the early 1960s.
Can you repeat the title, please?
The title is Auschwitz drängt uns auf einen Fleck. Matthias Lorenz. Just mentioned, argued that, and Walser argued that the Holocaust would never have occurred had all German and European Jews assimilated as successfully as did Klemperer. It should be noted, by the way, that had Klemperer, despite his total assimilation, by the way, not been married to a German Gentile woman, I think it's quite clear. Referred to the constant recalling of Germany's crimes in the Holocaust as, and I quote, permanent representation of our shame. He deplored a quote, instrumentalization of our shame for current purposes, and again, a quote, a negative nationalism that was disseminated by intellectuals, quote, again, being a major cultural events, were important representatives of the political, cultural, media, and business elites. Apart from an East German Lutheran minister by the name of Friedrich Schorlemmer, who you should know and perhaps invite, maybe, whatever, only two people other than Friedrich Schorlemmer did not rise to applaud. The then chairman, which was November 9, 1998, so a couple of weeks later, in which he analyzed the speech and accurately characterized it as essentially deeply troubling and anti-Semitic, was their noticeable rise in criticism of Weise. Yet it was, interestingly, precisely the German left that mostly remained silent. I spent that academic year in Berlin and experienced these were expressions of an otherwise scant solidarity with boobies, especially outside the Jewish community. Let me contextualize this to you briefly. Concrete is this, it's a very pedigreed, very interesting, has undergone many changes. It was actually one of the major writers from Concrete and editors was Ulrike Meinhof, the voice, started in the early 60s, actually 50s, even late 50s. And it underwent a lot of changes, and since 1991, I mean, it was edited already before, it kind of took a very interesting turn. The page clearly indicates the paradigm shift that occurred in Germany and the attack on Friedman. Former cultural minister and very eminent philosopher, Julian Niederrümelin, emphasized that Walse was, and he said, I'm quoting, a key literary and intellectual figure in Germany. According to formerly just an electoral campaign, one could celebrate a political culture of openness and tolerance in Germany. We in Germany, this is something we say in a sense of pride in our country, self-critical but also self-confidently patriotic, are allowed to do this. Okay? In other words, a social democratic chancellor and a social democratic secretary, Friedrich actually wrote a brilliant book on Nazi past of German lawyers, or Nazi past of important West German legal profession. Okay, that was his major publication. He published his book on The Fire, as a comprehensive work on, quote, the camp, the special task forces for rounding up and massacring the Jews in occupied Europe, as you well know. Although certain prominent scholars, notably, for instance, Hans-Ulrich Wehler, certainly a major German historian, criticized the book very, very heavily. If you read the criticism, they mostly object to the glib writing style and the analysis. And we'll do here, 2 weeks ago, at a fascinating conference on anti-Americanism in Princeton, and a German journalist used this picture it was phenomenal. In the 57-year history of Metall, the monthly journal, there's never been a book, Wolfgang Kraushaar. When this came out in June, late June, I mean, I've never seen media coverage like this. Amazing research. It was intended, this bomb, of course, 31-year anniversary of Kristallnacht. It was intended to explode during the commemoration of again, the issue of power. One of the conspirators had spent the summer before that in a kibbutz in Israel. The next summer, he then spent in a Fatah camp in Lebanon. Thus, to conclude,
very interesting lecture.
Thank you.
Very erudite as well. I want to make one minor point and one perhaps less minor. You mentioned the Israeli psychoanalyst who said the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz, which is a very astute saying. And I'm going to go this market company against the Catholic Church, right, so it has to be seen in that context. Right. This is the minor point. The major point is what the Germans call the Vergangenheitsüberwältigung.
Bewältigung. Nicht Überwältigung.
Yeah, sure, of course, I'm sorry. The Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which would be translated as mastery of the past. Perhaps it's a collective illusion of whether it is actually taking place.
Do I have a week? Okay, can I respond?
Do you want one by one?
Well, I'd like to say something to this. This is a major question. I mean,
Okay.
I don't mean to.
No.
Here's, look, the answer is twofold. Moderation by the popes of the Central Committee. By the way, the only thing that was really, really popular in East Germany was this, that they did not have to feel guilty. The West Germans were all the Nazis. In fact, there's examples that some East German kids thought that the Volksarmee, or the liberation, that they were liberating from the Nazis together with the Red Army, right? Which is true that it says that, but of course the Austrians never went into the next paragraph, where the Moscow Declaration said, but that does not exonerate you. You have to look at the responsibility that you did in the Hitler war machine. And so, to answer your question, I actually think that the West Germans have done a tremendous amount. Again, to my satisfaction, by left liberal enlightenment, the Jews have now gone to the dark side, by virtue of Israel's power.
Okay. You want one by one, because otherwise we run.
No, fine, then let's collect them.
Okay, we collect. First Shalom, then Joel, then Rich.
So this was the first occasion where that I was witness to. Another occasion, of course, of the Golda Kreisky encounter. The two socialists, two Jews, a train carrying Russian Jews and the Austrian border was hijacked by terrorists, hostages were taken, and the single transit camp that existed in Vienna to collect these Jews en route to Israel was closed down in response to the ultimatum of the terrorists for the release of the hostages. Golda, who was then at the European Conference in Strasbourg, she put aside her set speech, which I had prepared for her, and she told the European Parliament in so many words, you have one or two choices. Choice number one is to not allow Jews, and particularly Israelis, freedom of travel in your countries because of the fact that the terrorists, and there had been a long list of terrorist outrages against El Al and so forth in Europe by then. And the other is to do something about it against the terrorists. And she was so outraged by what Kreisky had done that from Strasbourg she flew to Vienna, and it's entered into the folklore of Israel diplomacy that when she returned, she told the Israeli press, he didn't even offer me a glass of water. And that was the atmosphere of these two socialists. And Golda reminded him of his socialist credentials, and his answer was, you and I live in two different worlds. To which Golda says, indeed we do, two very, very different worlds. And she did something that I'd never seen before. She actually refused to join him in a joint press conference at the end of the meeting. Instead, she said to us, אין לי מה להגיד, אני לא אעמוד מול המצלמות עם האיש הזה, and she left via backstairs and flew back to Israel, flew back into what? Bang! Into the crisis of the Yom Kippur War. So that was number two. Then you got Golda and Willy Brandt. After the Yom Kippur War, she was seething at the fact.
Des autorités théologiques et politiques voient la cause de cette haine. Donc là, vous avez compris que pour moi l'antisémitisme, c'est, je m'en tiens bon à cette définition de Léon Poliakov. Je ne rentre pas dans les détails au départ, mais Léon Poliakov expliquait que c'était une animosité radicalement différente en raison de son intensité et de sa pérennité. Fondamental. D'un côté, nous avons Spinoza qui pense que la haine des Juifs cesserait s'ils abandonnaient le signe de la circoncision. Et Freud pense, lui, que seule la sublimation du complexe de castration, c'est-à-dire le dépassement de ce complexe, son intériorisation et le fait de ne plus en être la victime, si vous voulez, c'est-à-dire d'être joué par ce complexe, au contraire de le dominer, il tient au contraire à en montrer la force dans son rapport avec l'autorité politique et notamment avec la question de l'État. Et c'est là où nous allons rejoindre maintenant la question de l'État d'Israël. Voilà ce qu'il dit. À lui seul, écrit-il, donc à ce signe, je juge capable, ce signe de la circoncision, d'assurer à cette nation juive une existence éternelle. Si les principes même de leur religion n'amolinova, on lit mal Spinoza, on ne lit pas surtout la fin de sa vie, ce qu'il a écrit, notamment sur la grammaire hébraïque. Mais là, nous avons, si vous voulez, un élément très intéressant, qui est qu'il lie tout à fait la séparation des nations par la circoncision au fait que les choses pourraient peut-être changer si les Juifs... Freud n'a pas fait que des choses bien. Il a écrit des choses à un moment où il y a eu des massacres ici de Juifs. Il a oublié, par exemple, de dire qu'il était solidaire de ces Juifs. Mais il n'a pas dit non plus ce que les gens veulent lui faire dire, à savoir qu'il était hostile à l'État juif, c'est-à-dire au futur État juif. Il a une position antisioniste jeune. C'est pour ça que je rappelle cette phrase. Alors, j'en viens au deuxième aspect de mon propos, les enjeux inconscients, préconscients, conscients de cette résurgence mondiale de l'antisémitisme. Alors, la question que nous avons à comprendre, c'est le lien avec la renaissance de l'État juif dans cette histoire. J'allais dire en relation primaire avec un désir psychique masculin, car chez la femme, il prend un autre chemin d'identification, avec donc un désir psychique de rebroussement dans le ventre maternel. C'est-à-dire chez l'enfant, il y a ce fantasme de retourner dans le ventre, et c'est un stade, c'est qu'on ne peut pas, à mon avis, éviter de commencer une explication psychanalytique des attentats suicides, et on doit commencer à comprendre comment on en arrive à, dans certaines cultures, notamment islamiques, à constituer des attentats suicides, et à essayer de comprendre sur le plan psychanalytique ce que ça peut bien vouloir signifier. Je m'aperçois, comme je le disais tout à l'heure, que cette circoncision masculine n'empêche plus cette dite angoisse de submerger les populations musulmanes qui la pratiquent, au point qu'elles reprennent à leur compte des archétypes imaginaires de l'antisémitisme chrétien, les projettent massivement sur les juifs, inventent de nouveaux passages à la réalité. Mon hypothèse, donc, est que le nouvel antisémitisme, qui est héritier de l'antisémitisme chrétien, eh bien, nous savons que les Juifs ont tenté de sublimer cette angoisse de castration par le rite de la circoncision. Mais les premiers chrétiens ont cru pouvoir se débarrasser de cette angoisse de castration en se montrant capables de se débarrasser de la circoncision. En fait, on le sait, ils ont été de parias, mais c'était à l'intérieur d'une culture qui annonçait le mépris de la circoncision. C'était la culture frappée du sceau d'Hérodote, qui est très clair sur ce mépris. Et là, ce n'est pas du tout le cas des chrétiens, qui eux sont en position défensive interne. Car à la différence des païens, qui peuvent revendiquer, même encore aujourd'hui d'une certaine manière, si tant est qu'il en existe, de l'anéantisation occidentale. Car ça, c'est un autre volet. J'ai montré dans plusieurs dépêches dans Metula qu'il y a toute une histoire de l'anéantisation occidentale, évidemment de Dostoïevski jusqu'à Camus, Camus étant du bon côté, hein, jusqu'à Camus en passant par aujourd'hui Gilles Deleuze, qui a fait l'éloge d'Arafat, des choses comme ça. Il y a toute une filière.
Jocelyn Attaf, je suis pédopsychiatre et secrétaire de la Société israélienne de psychanalyse. Je voudrais vous questionner sur 3 points, avoir des éclaircissements. Le premier, sur l'universalité de l'antisémitisme. que le programme proclame une juive. Ils ne le ressentent pas et on ne peut pas les forcer à être antisémitistes simplement pour proclamer et utiliser peut-être aussi l'universalité soi-disant universalité de l'antisémitisme. C'est vrai que la majorité du monde chrétien et du monde musulman l'est, mais c'est important de repérer, justement par rapport à votre analyse, qui est l'universalité du complexe de castration. Donc, il y a une universalité du complexe de castration, mais il n'y aurait pas d'une référence à ce moment-là. Est-ce qu'il voulait parler de Jésus? C'est une première écoute, c'est celle-là. En fait, dans cette image que vous donnez de l'État d'Israël comme pénis, comme ça, autour, entouré en tout cas de la Oumma musulmane, islamique, ça devait être, si tant est, un pénis circoncis, c'est-à-dire qui porte en lui l'image d'Abraham, c'est-à-dire que l'image de Dieu, l'État d'Israël, parce que c'est un État laïque, parce qu'un État qui ne reconnaît pas Dieu, qui n'est pas officiellement circoncis, c'est-à-dire qui porte en lui la marque divine, mais qui essaie de se déclarer comme un État laïque, ouvert à tout le monde, où on peut être religieux, on peut ne pas l'être aussi, mais qui n'est pas défini comme tel dans sa structure.
Ça peut être soit général, soit universel. Et on peut penser que pour Freud, il s'agit beaucoup plus de... et là, il y a eu des débats très importants pour savoir si les phénomènes de culture ne renvoient pas à un autre modèle que celui de Freud.
Interview, however hostile, you have to grasp the nettle and bite the bullet, so very often I would be invited to go into the studio, and there cold turkey see footage of soldiers' bones being broken, or God knows what, and so forth. And you just have to know, to think on your feet. But the times were no way comparable to what we have today. That is to say, you were not speaking necessarily to a prejudiced, biased, hostile public as you are today. Also, I would have a monthly meeting with Mugridge. Interestingly enough, I once asked him if he would allow me to speak to his reporting staff, his broadcasting staff, because I wanted to explain to them to what extent what they are reporting impacts upon the decision-making processes in Jerusalem, as I've been indicated for Begin, the BBC, what it was. But he would not allow it, and he said to me openly that if I were to meet with his broadcasting staff and tell him what I just told him, they would seize up in the knowledge of the responsibility that they are carrying. So instead of just reading the news, they would start putting emotion into their voices. And the BBC has its resonance peculiar to itself, with all the dispassion of a commentator describing a cricket match. This is how the BBC likes the tone of its voice in those days. Now you can hear, you see the sneer on the face when they mention certain words, like settler and so forth. They say much more judgmental, I think. But no, I was quite happy with the BBC in my time.
Well, let's come to domestic issues. You were a foreign ministry official for 40 years. In practice, you are seconded to the Prime Minister's office for 30 years. In the book, you are frequently critical of our foreign office. You mention how low an opinion, you already mentioned Abba Eban, you mentioned how low an opinion Prime Minister Eshkol had of Foreign Minister Abba Eban. He says in the presence of two senior officials and yourself about him, I have to call up the knowledgeable fool. you quoted in your book Eshkol as saying, Eban has never the right solution, only the right speech. You mention how Rabin circumvents Eban. You write that Golda Meir didn't trust him. Elsewhere in the book there is an indication of the low opinion you yourself have of the foreign ministry. When Rabin resigns and you are for a very short time without a job, you are right how you are worrying to have to go to a bureaucrat in the foreign office to obtain an ambassadorship in a third world country. But what is wrong with Israel's foreign ministry?
I failed miserably, if that is the impression that my book gives, because I'm not judgmental of the foreign ministry as such. I'm simply trying to explain that when you're working, when you are one of the few of the coterie surrounding a prime minister, that is to say that he has his personal aide who's in charge of who goes in and who goes out to the room, who looks after the diary, and so on. He's got his spokesman, he's got his military secretary and so on, he's got his guy like me. There are 4 or 5 of you, and it's a very protective atmosphere. The Lishkat Rosh HaMemshala. There is you're absolutely over and above bureaucracy. It doesn't exist. As a matter of fact, because of the people know that you have entry and access, then they treat you accordingly. You are hounded by the press. That is true, but when the first time a change of administration ever took place in Israel, it was historic, 1977. Likud, Begin wins the election after a millennium of Mapai and Labour leadership. I took it totally for granted that I was going back to my alma mater, to the foreign ministry, and simply the thought of leaving that closeted womb of the Prime Minister's bureau, not the office, the bureau, back to the bureaucracy of a foreign ministry where dog eat dog. It was a difficult moment. But then came a phone call to say that the Prime Minister wants to see you, namely Begin, and he asked me to stay on, and I was astonished. I mean, who was I to? I mean, after 30 years in the political wilderness, surely he would want his own people, but he had this principle, Begin, as much as possible to apply the British system of the permanency of the civil service. I remember he used to me the expression, we have entered office to sow, not to reap. And so this is why I and others like Dan Patil and Floyke, the military secretary, we all stayed on. So nevertheless, when you are there, sitting there, you have access to material that nobody else ever sees. In other words, you have almost a totality of a picture of the most sensitive cables and so forth, you know, for the Prime Minister's eyes only. But a good Lishkat Rosh HaMemshala, which Begin's was, a good bureau, it was under Yechiel Kadishai, who was the nicest man I've ever met. There was harmony, and for example, suddenly I'm a big machar. I'm appointed ambassador to the court of St. James from the Kuwait. Now that means, when I sat there behind my desk at the embassy in London, I felt that I had been reduced in rank, because suddenly I had no material except the press cables from Haaretz and Jerusalem Post, and another cable here and there, which was never terribly important, and of course there were moments, you know, when some things did become important, like I don't want to say this out loud, when forged British passports were found, and I'm summoned to the Foreign Secretary, Geoffrey Howe, throws them at you. These are yours. No, they're not. Or when a certain Mordechai Vanunu just, and you're summoned directly to Mrs. Thatcher into a room. And I had already rehearsed. Mr. Vanunu left these shores of his own volition through normal departure procedures. No British law was, you know, I'd stood in the mirror in front of the bathroom to learn. Mr. Vanunu left this country of his own volition. No British law was violated. So yes, she said, but now come on, the Prime Minister, Mr. left this country 3 times. I repeated it, and they said, okay. So there were such things. Is one thing that's very important. Having spent so many years with different prime ministers, wherever I went in London, they knew I had direct access to the Prime Minister's office, as opposed to the bureaucracy of the Foreign Office, and that did no harm to my credibility.
If I may comment. The description of dog eats dog at the Foreign Ministry doesn't really express great admiration for the place.
Okay.
Final question before we throw it open to the floor. You have watched 5 prime ministers up close. What do you think is real leadership and greatness at times of great stress and crisis? And how would you rank these 5 prime ministers as to leadership and greatness, and why?
Well, I do appreciate that. The fact, Manfred, you did send me the questions in advance, and so I'm going to quote from a speech I recently made on leadership. The greatest lesson of all that I learned in the Prime Minister's office is the meaning of the word leadership. We brandish the word but seldom define it. On the top of a hill outside the capital of Australia, Canberra, where I once served, is a lonely gravestone located in the grounds of an isolated homestead. On it are etched the words, "Leadership is wisdom and courage, and a great carelessness of self." A great carelessness of self. I take those words to mean that true leaders must be ready to risk their own futures in order to do what is right. It means there are times when a leader must act against the advice even of his own experts and be guided by that little elf, that tiny creature who inhabits an area between the navel and the brain, and who tugs at your nerve ends and says, "No, don't go that way, go the other way." That is one of my definitions of what I learned of leadership. Now, as for the people actually involved with this, we shall end. Let's say, Eshkol emerges in my eyes from my writing, from the book, as a Harry Truman of Israel. That is to say, this man who inherited the giant Ben Gurion, who harassed him endlessly, when it came to the crunch, after having been seen to be indecisive leading up to the actual 6-day war, so much so that Begin himself went to Ben Gurion, who had persecuted him throughout his whole political life and almost had him killed at the time of the Altalena. He went to Ben Gurion and appealed to him to take over the leadership on the eve of the 6-day war because, quote, "You are a war leader and Eshkol is not." And at the end of the day, as you know, public pressure forced Eshkol to surrender up the defense ministry, hand it over to Dayan. But when it came to the crunch, and Tzva Haganah Yisrael did what it did in the space of 6 days, it had been Eshkol as defense minister over the years who had built up the Israel Defense Forces to do what they did. And when we look back in the context of history, just as Truman, who followed the giant Roosevelt, when it came to the Cold War, he bit the bullet. And he was the one who established the Baghdad Pact, and he was the one who fought in Korea, and who was the one who prepared America to fight the Cold War. As for Golda, as I said, she emerges in my eyes as a heroic yet tragic figure, and she was the last of the disillusioned Zionist socialists. Nevertheless, again, when it came to the crunch, as Ben-Gurion described her, Yom Kippur War, she was the only man in the cabinet. Rabin, in my book I read the historic justice to Rabin. I read the historic justice to Rabin because he's never been given the credit that is due him. That had it not been for that interim agreement that he negotiated from Sinai through the intermediary of Kissinger, the fact that they argued endlessly. At one point, at the time of that crisis, when I mentioned the shuttle, and I didn't do on Shabbat what I should have done, as Kissinger was leaving, he swung around and he turned to Rabin, and I quote, he said, "Yitzhak, you will be responsible for the destruction of the Third Jewish Commonwealth." And Rabin, red in the face, said to him, "And Henry, don't forget, you will be judged not by American history, but by Jewish history." And then off he went to the airport and blamed us for whatever he blamed us. But as I say, it all resolved itself a few months later. And an interim agreement was established in Sinai, and it is not true to say that not a single Israeli soldier has fallen on the Egyptian front since the signing of the Egyptian treaty with the Treaty of Egypt in 1979, or since that came in 1977. Not a single Israeli soldier has fallen on the Egyptian front since 1975, September the 1st, when that interim agreement was established in Sinai, and Rabin had, again with his conceptualizations, fulfilled what he said: in order to advance the peace, we have to do three things. Number one, we have to disengage with the enemy. Disengagement will lead to diffusion. Diffusion will lead to trust, and trust will lead to negotiation. And if you look at the whole Rabin record, you will see he remained faithful to that concept throughout. Disengagement, diffusion, trust, negotiation. This, I think, is spelled out pretty much in my book to give him that credit. And as for Begin, I love the man. I love the man. He was, to me, the quintessential Jew. He was very complex. He was haunted by the Holocaust. So much so that it influenced every single decisive decision he ever made. Part of the reason why he went to war in Lebanon in the manner that he did against a PLO state within a state in southern Lebanon was this Holocaust complex. There is a letter that he wrote to Reagan. It's not published in my book. I only discovered it afterwards, and I'm glad I only discovered it afterwards, because it adds no glory to Begin. It's a letter to Reagan in which he said, as they were battling in Beirut, in the streets of Beirut, in order to compel Arafat and his minions to leave Lebanon altogether for foreign ports, not least Tunisia, he writes to Reagan that as I fight this battle, I have the same feeling as the Allies must have had as they were approaching Hitler's bunker. And to me, Arafat is the same as him, the Nazi Hitler, and so forth. He was obsessed with the, and I'm not quite sure whether they understood the limits of power. That is, if you think for a moment, after the peace with Egypt, that is after the Yom Kippur War, literally all the wars we've had with our neighbors have been initiated by us. I begin with the war in Lebanon. There was a famous address, a famous article he wrote about wars of choice. This was a war of choice. It continued with Lebanon too. It continues with Operation Kaslan. They were always provoked. But the fact is that what we did was more than retaliation. It was going to war. However, history is treating Begin with compassion and kindness. He is remembered not for the Lebanon War, which was over 600 casualties, but he's remembered for the peace treaty with Egypt. So much so that the polls now put him as #1 ahead of Ben Gurion as the greatest Prime Minister of Israel. So that is how I would evaluate the Prime Ministers. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know that you'll agree with me. None of us have been disappointed by this magnificent exchange and interview. I'm going to take questions in groups of 3. 1, 2, 3.
Yes, well, I'd like to first thank you for a very... Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I'd like to first thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm sure your book is even more interesting, and I'm going to read it. I'd like to ask you very briefly about Begin, which was the last one you mentioned. In your opinion, was it healthy for a prime minister to live in the past? In other words, we know, for example, that not only did he compare Arafat to Hitler, but when he met with an American representative or ambassador, he was singing the partisan song, Zog Nishken Mol, which was a famous partisan song of the Holocaust of the Second World War. So was it healthy for a prime minister to conduct his actions as if he were living in the past? The second is about Shimon Peres. My question is whether, in fact, not being a charismatic leader is actually an advantage for a leader, in the sense that Peres not only reduced the hyperinflation in the 1980s, but he also took us out of Lebanon, of the Meir of Lebanon, so that he did two great things, even though he was not a charismatic leader. So that in some ways a charismatic leader may be better for the people than a non-charismatic leader may be more healthy and better for the people than
it was Barak who took us out of Lebanon.
Yes, but Peres also in the early 1980s began the action of withdrawing from Lebanon. Barak actually did it much later.
Okay.
And the third thing has to do with Golda, the incident you mentioned about Golda and Kreisky, when Golda said, "I'm not going to stand together with this man for a press conference or photo opportunity." This reminded me again of Ben Gurion saying about Begin, "I'm not going to talk to this man," or "I'm not going to," you know, he always said...
who's sitting next to
yeah, right.
He
never even mentioned his name. He always said, "This man, that man." Now, this brings me to the question of the black and white thinking. Golda, the way I see her at least, you may see her differently, but the way I see her was a black and white kind of leader. She said always either this or that. I mean, either you're like this or you're not like this. And black and white thinking may not be, again, I'm talking about healthy and unhealthy kinds of psychological attitudes in political leadership. So some leaders may have been more black and white kind of thinkers than other leaders, and I would appreciate your telling us what you think of the different prime ministers, which of them were more like black and white thinkers and others who saw more subtle gradations of reality.
Right.
Thank you very much.
No, I'm sorry. Yes.
Mr. Ambassador, with all of your experience, do you see Israel under siege today?
Right. Okay, go.
Okay, Ambassador Avner, Artie Gelman from Manfred. First of all, I want to say that I'm just enthralled. So my first question is, can we stay here all day and listen to you? And maybe tomorrow. Secondly, this is a bit out of left field. Natan Sharansky, who's now the head of the Jewish Agency, has purposely changed the focus, or is attempting to change the focus of the agency's mission from Aliyah Klita to Jewish identity. Do you see a diminishment of Jewish identity in Israel today as a strategic threat to the state of Israel? And you also see that reflected in today's diplomatic corps?
Okay, good. Is it healthy for a Prime Minister to live in the past? Of course it's not healthy. Yes, Begin, I presume you can say he did live in the past, in the sense of the Holocaust. He lost his whole family. Come with me into the Oval Office. 1977, July, the first meeting between Begin and Jimmy Carter, president. Everybody was not surprised, but shocked by the Begin election to the Blue Mission. You remember Time magazine? Begin rhymes with Fagin. Jimmy Carter writes in his own diaries about being a warmonger. The Labour here they held conferences. They said it was an aberration. Ben Aaron even said that we don't. Ben Aaron even said that we don't have to. It's undemocratic. This was the atmosphere. So here we are there in the Oval Office, and this is about Begin living in the past. And Jimmy Carter is cartering him with, and at one point, and I'm now quoting more or less, Begin is explaining the historic right of the Jewish people to Hamoledet, as it's called Hamoledet, the homeland, the biblical homeland. And Jimmy Carter is looking at him with glazed eyes, and Begin says to him these words: "Mr. President, what I've just been saying might sound to you moot, but to us it is our living history. And our living history has taught us that whenever we are threatened or attacked, we are always alone. And there was a time when our menfolk even had to hand over their women and children to their executioners. We were tertiated, Mr. President." And Jimmy Carter looked up and said, "What was that word, Mr. Prime Minister?" And Begin said, "Tertiated, not decimated. The origin of the word decimation is 1 in 10. When the Roman legion was found guilty of insubordination, 1 in 10 was put to the sword. In our instance, Mr. President, it was 1 in 3, tertiated." And then he banged the table. He said, "I take an oath in the name of the Jewish people, this will never, ever happen again." And then he broke down in tears. And a silence descended on the Oval Office. It was a thunderous silence that was a momentous political statement. And Carter never, ever mentioned ever again anything that could have any association whatsoever with the Holocaust and its ramifications. And if I were an incorrigible romantic, I would say that the beginning, the seeds of Camp David were planted at in that silence of that July day in 1977. So, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? The fact is, out of Menachem Begin, when Sadat landed on November the 17th, 1977. So there we were around Begin, waiting, saw the lights in the sky descending, and I heard Begin say to Dayan, "Note, it's to me he came." And they pointed to Golda, not to the others. So, when it came to that, his knowledge of the past compelled him to make peace in the present at the cost of giving up whatever he gave up. He gave up the Yamit and the whole of the Sinai and all that went with it. And those of us who lived in those years remember the trauma of the dislocation and the destruction of those settlements. But when it came to Lebanon, he was driven by a Holocaust complex. Yosef Borg was dead against the Lebanon invasion. And Begin said to him, if we don't do it, Yosef, it will be another Holocaust. I've got it. I've got the transcript. Holocaust. As for Peres, I don't think Peres was such a non-charismatic figure, actually. I think, a man who can say peace, just as a bird cannot fly with one wing, or a person can't applaud with one hand, then a country cannot make peace with itself. That is charismatic poetry. You listen to that kind of thing. However, I'm giving you my totally subjective feeling. There were times when Peres was enormously simplistic. At a meeting I was present with when he met with Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister, and he was in favor of an international conference. He saw no reason, why not? They'll put their point of view, we'll put our point of view. I'm one of those dead against international conferences. But nevertheless, give Peres power as a Prime Minister in certain areas, certain issues, he's superb. The fact is, he was a loser. He never got that chance except once, and then for 6 months by default after Rabin's assassination.
And the 2 years rotation.
I'm saying the 2 years rotation, and then Golda was black and white. You're dead right. I think Golda was black and white. She was a straight-laced a lady that I ever met. When she was foreign minister, one of my colleagues was found in bed with somebody, and 24 hours later, you didn't see him anymore. It was out. She told Oriana Fallaci that she never fell out of love with her husband, Marcus. This was an answer to a question by Fallaci, did you ever think of remarrying? He said, I've always been too much in love with whom she separated from and divorced. No, I think they didn't divorce, they just separated. But I would put her into the black and white category. I think that's one of the reasons why she won the Yom Kippur War. She saw the consequences of not winning utter destruction. I have a scene in my book where Diane is saying to her that unless we replenish quickly, we are not going to win the war. And she looks at him in horror and says, what, you mean to say defeat, utter defeat? And then she had the guts to do what she did with Nixon and with Kissinger, and to twist her arm until came the airlift that saved us. Do I think that Israel under siege? Yes, I do. Conor Cruz O'Brien, 25 years ago, wrote a book called The Siege. I think it's one of the finest secondary sources of the history of Israel that there is. And I think it's most appropriate. The problem that we have with the media is that they look at it through the prism of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and not the totality of this little strip of territory, which is so small that the cartographer doesn't have enough room on it to write its name, and half of the IS is always spilled into the Mediterranean Sea. 22 Arab states, from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean, larger than the United States of America, a population greater than the United States of America. That context is never given because nobody's got time to see it. Nobody's interested in seeing it. They're interested in seeing pictures. People today get their news from the screen, and the screen deals in images. It doesn't deal in facts. And there's no answer. There's simply no answer to the picture of the Arab woman clinging a child to her breast. None. So, I think we are under siege in the sense that even those with whom we've made peace, it's not peace between peoples, it's peace between governments. The civilian protocols of all of the two peace treaties are hollow and empty, and the military protocols are being kept. Those are the most important protocols. But otherwise, we are still not accepted in the Middle East, and we're still deemed to be the enemy. Forget Jihad and so forth. I'm talking about the inner circle and the outer circle. You know, we won't go into those details. Now, as for Sharansky, I was dining with him 2 weeks ago on Friday night. This subject, we were talking about this subject. As a matter of fact, I put to him a project. If you think of the block along Rehov Kerem Melech George, King George Street, where you go from Yeshurun Shul, after that the Avichai Center next door the Sochnut, next door to that Beit Meir, next door to that Beit Knesset HaGadol, next door to that Heichal Shlomo, and across the road you have got the Conservative Center, and just behind you've got the Ben Tzvi Center. I put it to him that here is your opportunity to create a kiryah in the spirit of what you're talking about, of Jewish identity, to transform this whole area into a kiryah, the Ye'am HaYehudi. All the institutions are there. This is a vision, this is a song. But the answer is it a strategic threat to Israel? Of course it's a strategic threat to Israel. If we lose the grip on our narrative, then why should our grandkids, my grandkids, got 3 of them serving in the army? I think that this is under this present Ministry of Education that we have. I think that there is a deep understanding and perception of that. Otherwise, I don't want to think of the otherwise.
And the Foreign Service?
Of the Foreign Service? I don't know. I just don't know. Look, I attended the memorial to the fallen of the Foreign Service on the eve of Yom HaZikaron. It was not only dignified, those of us in Misrad HaChutz, we saw it was there. We did not read of it. It expressed a very, very profound inner Jewish feeling of grief. Not Israeli, Jewish. So, hopefully, yes. At the same time, I got an email the other day from a fellow. Why is it that you went to Santiago, Chile on the occasion of Yom HaTzmaut and all the food was chadar trefa there? I say, well, what can I do about it? When I was Inspector General of the Foreign Service, I tried to introduce kashrut in all our embassies. And I got a special budget for it. And I went around from embassy to embassy like a mashgiach, explaining to them and this, that, and the other. And I got them, the kelim, I got everything, and so on. But, you know, kashrut consists of 101 little things, and if you're born into it, you take it for granted. But if you don't take it for granted, you have to learn that all you have to do is to bring in one thing into the cake, and that's not kasher. Bye-bye kashrut. So, yeah.
Okay, next round I've got one, and in the back. You start, Ruth.
Yehuda, I too want to thank you.
Your mic's not on, I don't think.
Yehuda, I want to thank you as well. I've already done so in writing, and I really enjoyed the book. Before my question, I just want to say that you referred to the peace process that Peres referred to, but he always called it the piss process, and I'm not sure that that's not what he really meant. Help me, son. I'm referring actually to Manfred's first question. When you were collecting all these papers, did you have in mind that at some stage in your life you would write the book, or did this happen much later when you said, "Oh, I've got all these papers, why don't I write them?"
I did not have in mind writing the book. No. I suppose there's some instinct that is in every one of us that at the back of your mind you realize that there is intrinsic value, and I was naughty. As I say, I was hauled over the coals by a ministerial committee.
I'll stand so you can see who's speaking.
Indeed.
But from the rustic wilds of Canberra, which happen to be the national capital, and where apparently there are some gems of wisdom to be found, and where it was once possible.
He was the Gabba of our shoe.
Where it was once possible to see the Israeli ambassador walking to Shul on Shabbat, followed by a police car and accompanied by a police officer. I want to ask you something else which you more or less alluded to. I think you may have some opinion on this. You've been a fly on a wall with our prime ministers, but also with other world leaders. Do you feel able to rate our prime ministers against other world leaders?
Right, hold it. Someone in the back there, yes.
Good morning. You spoke about leadership and Rabin's formula of disengagement, diffusement, trust, and negotiation. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the very end of Rabin's life, on whether the third element there of trust had been had gone by the wayside. Was Rabin at the end of his life very on board? I've read alternatively that he'd come to question quite deeply the Oslo process. What's your thought on the matter?
Thank you.
Rating our Prime Minister, other world leaders, I rate Eshkol as follows. His moment of truth came in Johnson's Ranch after the Six-Day War, when he literally appealed, pleading for the Phantom aircraft, telling Johnson that we are now weaker today vis-a-vis our enemies than we were on the eve of the Six-Day War because of the Russian replenishment of the Arab arsenals, which included sophisticated MiGs, and all our aircraft had been French, and they had de Gaulle had slapped an arms embargo on us. And so, yes, there was pleading in his voice. When McManaman said to him, would but that you would come here other than for aircraft, but to talk to us about peace, his answer was, number one, would but that I could go elsewhere for aircraft. Tell me where to go. And number two is, I am ready to sit down with our neighbors not as victors, but as equals. It would but that they would come to the table. In return, what he got was the 3 no's of Khartoum. But the Johnson, big, beefy Texan, as that he was moved. I don't say that the American strategy to align itself with Israel, which is what happened at that, to become its main arms supplier, happened because of the pleading of Eshkol, but it certainly got through to the man who'd been told by his mammy and daddy, and this was, I quote, my mammy and daddy told me I have to treat the Jews right. Then Golda, formidable, big, to the point of even scaring a guy like Kissinger. No bones about it whatsoever. with her handbag. She never banged the table with her fist. She always knew that she was on the wallpaper when she put her handbag on the table. Yes, and she could have won at the same time. She could be the compassionate grandmother, and within that cold exterior there lay a heart of stone when necessary. I mean, it was. Look at Rabin and Clinton. This was an extraordinary friendship that also had diplomatic consequences in Israel's favor. Clinton's speech at Rabin's funeral, Shalom Chaver, as we were leaving the funeral back to the buses, I bumped into Elie Wiesel, and I said, "No, what do you think of Clinton's speech?" And he said, "I managed to finish it 10 minutes before we landed." And so I could go on. It's, you know, Begin was defiance, Jewish pride. Anybody who dealt with Begin, I mean, the two presidents dealt with Begin. One was Carter, and the other was Reagan. They knew that on certain subjects, certain issues, it was but you know, I think take Jerusalem. Begin would not even talk about Jerusalem. He never. You remember Camp David at the very, very end, when they were about to go out and sign before all the world cameras and CNN, and Carter came to Begin. He said, "There's just one last thing, a side letter to the agreement that you will agree to talk about and put Jerusalem on the agenda." And then Begin raised his hand and said, "You miskach yemini." No way. And then there followed the correspondence between Sadat and Begin about Jerusalem. And Begin used to write him about the Maccabees, and he told him the story of Rabbi Amnon ben Megenza, how he was I won't go into the detail, but it was so. That's world leaders. Now finally, Oslo, the Rabin that I knew, he would have long ago given up on Oslo. He disliked Arafat. You know the famous scene of the. You've heard the famous story how before they stepped out on the White House lawn, how Rabin asked Clinton, for God's sake, don't let him kiss me. And so if you look very, very carefully at that, you see how Clinton places them squarely between the two of them, and then when it comes to Peres's turn to shake Arafat's hand, he leans right over and Rabin whispers something into Peres's ear. And I asked Rabin, "Ma amarta, what did you say?" So I said to him, "Ata lo chayav lenashek oto." Yes, I can't prove, I can only, my instinct tells me that.
Last run now. 2 more, please. Okay. No more? Judge, you were the last one.
Based on your experience in the past that you have described eloquently, when you hear nowadays what the Prime Ministers of Israel says about the coming negotiations now and the others, do you feel that there's a real intention this time to come to some kind of positive arrangement?
First of all, I owe you a debt of honor. And that debt of honor is in the Eichmann trial. You helped me translate, Mishulovish and I were translating the Hausner speech. And you were number 2 to Hausner. And it was very difficult to translate certain expressions. and I would always come to you and you would help me find the English words for them. So thank you. Number two is, do I think, you know, anybody in this room can answer my own personal view? The answer is no. Number one, what are proximity talks? What are proximity talks? At best they are under the same roof, adjacent rooms, and the mediator jumps from room to room. Here, it's a half an hour drive you have to, Mitchell has to go each time. Second of all, it's tossed us back to 1991, to pre-Oslo, to indirect negotiations, a principle on which Israel consistently, my Prime Minister, refused to countenance as the formula towards peace, only direct negotiations. I cannot pretend to put myself into the mind of what Bibi's ultimates will are, but I see in the proximity talks, I fear we're entering into a tunnel situation, into a tunnel from which it's going to be very difficult to extricate ourselves. And that is to say, it is, in my view, a prescription for additional pressures on us, unilaterally, by the Obama administration.
Way over our time, but I'm sure you'll agree with me. It's been great. Please express our appreciation to both.